We're delighted to welcome you to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival protected by Dettol. Today's session is presented by Embassy of Ireland, directly from Darbar Hall of Diggy Palace. A Ghost in the Throat, Doireann Ní Ghríofa in conversation with Jayanti Naju Seth. A stunning narrative which molds together essay and autofiction, Doireann Ní Ghríofa's debut book, A Ghost in the Throat, explores the intense connections between two women separated by centuries. A poem written by an Irish woman in the 1700s after her husband's murder is evoked by a young housewife in the present day. Exploring landscapes and inner spaces, the tale follows the obsessive parallels between their lives and journeys. Poet and essayist, Ghríofa's other books include Lies and Clasp. She has received the Rooney Prize for Irish Literature in the year 2016. In conversation with Jayanti Naju Seth, they dive into this timeless tale of a woman finding her voice by reaching into the past and finding another's. Doireann Ní Ghríofa is a poet and essayist, author of 7 books of poetry, each a deepening exploration of birth, death, desire and domesticity. Her most recent book is the bestseller, A Ghost in the Throat. Jayanti Naju Seth recently retired as a head of the Department of English, Jesus and Mary College after a career spanning 40 years. Her reading of Irish literature began while studying at Trinity College, Dublin, and has continued up to the present. She has edited and published 2 collections of essays on Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice and on Marquis's Chronicle of a Death Foretold, respectively. Please do remember to comment by typing into the comments section on your screens. Ladies and gentlemen, presenting A Ghost in the Throat, Doireann Ní Ghríofa in conversation with Jayanti Naju Seth.
So we're here today to discuss a wonderful book, A Ghost in the Throat, with its author, Doireann Ní Ghríofa. I can't tell you how many weeks I have waited for this, Doireann. It's just a wonderful opportunity. Welcome. Welcome.
Thank you, Jayanti. I wish so much that I could be there with you and your colleagues and the audience today, but unfortunately the strange times we're living in have prevented that kind of sense of travel, hasn't it?
Well, let's all remind ourselves, hang in there, it'll happen. It'll happen. Okay, so we have here a text, an absolutely unique text in its blending of fiction, of autobiography, interspersed with elements of history. Would you classify this, Doireann, as a novel? And do you think it is important to classify it in this way at all? I remember when Truman Capote brought out In Cold Blood and he called it a non-fiction novel. He stirred up a hornet's nest with the literary critics and in the literary world saying, should we allow him such a nomenclature, a non-fiction novel? Well, I wanted to ask you, do you think this is in any way akin to that? And would you be satisfied simply to call it a literary creation?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question, Jayanti, and it's something that I've kind of been grappling with since publication. Before that, while I was immersed in the process of writing the book, it wasn't something that really struck me at all, these considerations of genre. I was so absorbed in almost the sense of adventure of chasing after the life of this woman who had lived hundreds of years before I was even born. And so I suppose submerged, in that adventure that I wasn't even thinking about these kind of questions. And then I've been so surprised since the book was published by how eager people are to discuss this element of it. What exactly is this book? Which genre does it fall into? And it's a question that comes up again and again. And I think it's interesting for any writer when they're on the journey of publication of a book. And when the book has left their laptop, say, or their notebooks and become something else out in the world, to observe the ways in which the book is still somehow teaching the writer something. And this is something that this book is still teaching me. What is it? What genre is it in? How to describe a book like this that describes such a strange time in my own life. And it's difficult, it's tricky, there are parts of this book that cleave very closely to the lived reality of that time in my life. And there are parts of this book that kind of swoop away more towards a flight of the imagination. And that was definitely something I was very aware of during the writing process, the sense of almost trespass on the life of another woman. How far did I dare to go into imagining the parts of her life that hadn't been written into the historical record? And was that, or could that be somehow a little cruel of me to let my imagination fly away like that into the life of another woman when she wasn't there to speak up for herself and say, no, that's not how it was? So I have struggled with that idea of Doireann, and I'm still learning how to describe it, I suppose, myself.
Thank you for that clarification. Let's go to the story itself now. It's not yet available. The last I checked, I may be wrong on this, but I think it is not available in India right now, except as the Kindle version, which is. And in fact, the copy that I was reading was very kindly given to me by the Irish Embassy, for which I am duly grateful. And I think it will be available for purchase next month. And next month is 2 days away. So I would ask you then to speak, Doireann, about the key and the core theme of it, the almost obsessive interest, if you will allow me to call it an obsessive interest, of a modern day woman, and the obsessive interest she has in a poem and in the poet, both of which, are separated from her by 200 years. I'd like you, in your answer, if you would, to also cover the standing of the original Kina in the Irish canon, as well as its personal meaning for you.
Yes, yeah. Well, I suppose one interesting and one probably important thing to say in answering your question is the fact that I was approaching this sense of research, or this sense of trying to come to know this other woman, this poet who had lived hundreds of years before me. I was kind of coming to that process not as an academic, not as someone who had been trained in this kind of pursuit, if we call it that, but just as an ordinary person. And I tried to evoke that as strongly as possible through the book, that sense of communicating to the reader that the narrator of this book is someone who's very much learning as they're going along, and that they're drawing the reader along with them on this process of adventure in learning about someone else. And the someone that we're talking about is a poet called Eileen Dubh Ní Chonaill. The point at which we pick up her story in the 1700s was a very fraught time in Ireland. And Ireland has, as you know, such a history of colonization brutality. And the point at which we pick up the story of her life, she was one of what would have been considered the old Irish nobility. So she was part of a system where the vestiges of it were still kind of lingering at the very edges of society. But at that point, English rule had changed things so that, will I let you get that?
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I thought I'd switched it off.
Don't worry at all. So that's the point where we pick it up, is where politically it was a very difficult time. There was a series of laws that had been introduced in Ireland called the Penal Laws, where the behaviour and the lives of Irish people were very much controlled. There was a whole new system of rules and laws in order to prevent them attaining a certain status in life, and to change the status of people as it had been established in Irish life before that. So, for example, Irish people would no longer be allowed to pursue certain professions, schooling, and in the context of the story of Eileen Dubh Ní Chonaill's life, Irish people were no longer allowed to hold a horse of a greater value than £5. And the reason that becomes important is because her husband, Arthur O'Leary, ended up in kind of a feud with someone who would have been allied with the New English system, Abraham Morris, who demanded that Eileen Dubh's husband, sell him his beautiful horse, which had been a gift from an empress in Europe, for £5, which was intensely insulting to Arthur O'Leary, and he refused, and ended up in a situation where there was an ambush made on him and he was murdered by a gang of English soldiers, legally at the time. And so that is the story of this point of Eileen Duffney Connell's life. The horse comes home without its rider, and she's looking out the window and sees the horse and knows instinctually what has happened to her husband. She leaps into the saddle. The horse carries her to where her husband's corpse has been thrown on the side of a hill, and she falls over his body, and in a moment of intense grief and passion, she scoops up handfuls of his blood, drinks it, and begins to speak this extraordinary poem, which it's kind of difficult to describe this element of it. She had observed over many years women keening in this old tradition, this old poetic tradition. And when she spoke her grief over his body, it emerged from her body in this old poetic form called the Queena or the Keen. And that was such a powerful utterance from her that it was over subsequent months and years memorized by other women, spoken again, memorized, recited again, and it was carried down through generations until eventually it was transcribed and published and accepted by the Academy. It's a huge part still of our literary canon in Ireland and England, and is widely studied and is celebrated, and very unusual for a work of literature by a woman, particularly in those times, to have survived to our modern times. So this is the poem that I came across as an ordinary person, not as a scholar or someone who was lecturing in a university, but just as an ordinary woman at home looking after 4 small children, and the ways in which this poem started to feel like an anchor to me in a very busy and sometimes very exhausting life, that I would find myself returning to it, Jayanti, again and again. This poem became a treasure to me, and the more I read and reread the poem, the more curious I became about the woman who had composed it. And really that was what set me off on this whole adventure of trying to find out, well, what else could I discover of her life?
Well, the truth is, Doireann, you may already know this, but we have a similar tradition of keening, but it's got similarities, it's got complete differences. In Rajasthan, here in India, where the Diggy Palace is and where the Jaipur Festival is usually held, which is Rajasthan, there is a system of female lower caste women being employed to come and mourn and and keen and sort of express their sorrow at the death of. It's the equation though is lower caste women singing for upper caste men.
Okay,
and there's
that's interesting.
Well, that's hugely different, of course, because here's a woman not only expressing her sorrow, her anguish, etc., but it's over a murdered husband, not just a dead husband, but a husband murdered very young. There are, but what I do find in common in the two traditions, though, is that it is the female voice, the genre of the female voice, that is carrying out this mournful sort of remembrance of a life, but much more personal in the case, as it's described in your book. Which brings me to something that is your first line, your last line, and interspersed almost like a refrain through the book is, this is a female text. It is indeed, I can think of, of why you would say this is a female text, though I would love to, for you to speak further on it. But I would like to point out that this is completely varying away from, it's swerving sharply away from the feminist texts, the novels that were written in the, in the early, in the 1970s, in the 1980s. And this is, in fact, not at all a litany of complaints about the hardships of the domestic role. It isn't that, and that's so refreshing. It is emphatically not, as in that much quoted passage from Madeline French's The Women's Room. It is not about shit and string beans being the beginning and the end of domestic life for women. I mean, Madeline French in an interview later said, well, you can't extract your brain from the shit and string beans, if that's all you're exposed to day and night. This is not that at all. And I found that this was, in here, the protagonist has a completely different view. There are lines from it that stay with me. I wonder if they love their drudge as much as I do, she says. And at another point, she speaks about her list of chores, which she has to go through day after day, and says, they are both my map and my compass. This is a celebratory view of the female role, as I can see it, both in life and in literature. And that's very, very important. I think it's like a swerving away from what we normally associate with feminist text, female text, though the two terms are not, of course, interchangeable. I would be very interested to hear your views on the women's movement, if you're willing to share it, and historically in the present day, what it meant for you, what you meant by this is a female text.
Well, that's a very interesting question. Thank you so much, Jayanti, and thanks for all the thought you've put into these questions and into reading the book. I'm very honoured by that and all the work you've put into this. Thank you.
I'd like nothing more than to teach your text one day. It's absolutely fascinating. It would take a semester at least to accomplish it.
Thank you. Thanks a million. That's so kind of you to say that. In terms of that phrase, and as you say, it is very much a refrain. It echoes through the book, which I think is partially, I suppose I kind of have to attribute that a little bit to my practice as a poet over many years, that I sometimes feel a certain phrase within a poem, or in this case within a longer text, insisting upon itself and becoming almost, the way I think of it is almost like the pulse. This is a phrase that recurs again and again throughout this book. This is a female text. And it might be illuminating to describe the way in which it first occurred to me. And it's as described in the book. I had taken to making, I suppose you could say, making pilgrimage in some way, or traveling to spend time in the places where we know Eileen Dovney Cunnell had spent time during her life. So, for example, the place that she grew up in, I spent time close to her marital home, but didn't succeed in infiltrating it because there are other people living there now, and I didn't want to trespass on their privacy. And one of the places where I spent a lot of time was Kilcrea Abbey, and that's very close to where my children go to school, actually. So I would go there quite a lot with my youngest child, a daughter, and spend time there, knowing that she had spoken her Quina over his body when she first found it, but she had also spoken it again at his wake, and that she had spoken it again when he was buried in Kilcrea. So every time that I stood there at his grave, I had a really strong sense that I wasn't just spending time there where he's buried, but that this was a place where she had spent time, where she had spoken these words. And it became such a powerful place for me to stand in this ruined abbey among all the old stones and among the dead. And to just spend time there was really important. And I think at some deeper subconscious level, it became more and more important for me to spend time there as I was researching the book. And one of the times that I was driving away, my daughter was in her car seat in the car, and this phrase just came into my head out of the blue. This is a female text, with such kind of strength beyond its insistence, that, if you're driving along and a thought occurs to you, oftentimes you will have forgotten it by the time you reach home. Yes. Or, thoughts come and go. That's ordinary. But it kept repeating again and again and again and again, and almost wouldn't leave me alone the whole way home. It kept, this is a female text, this is a female text. And I didn't understand what it meant, because that to me seems such a strange phrase. Like, what does that mean? Like, as you say, I would find it maybe more difficult, or maybe easier to acknowledge and understand a phrase like this is a feminist text. You know, I could make sense of that a little more easily. But what is a female text? What does that mean? And can a text be female? It was the fact, I think, that it was so insistent, and that it wouldn't let go of me. When I came home, I wrote it down. And I kept asking myself over and over again, what does this mean? And trying to come up with answers of what a female text could possibly be. And sometimes I failed, I think. Like, there are parts of the text I say where I name something and say, this is a female text. And I'm not sure that I always got it right, you know, and that's the interesting thing about writing a book, is that you're so captured in it, you're so caught up in it, that when you're beyond it, you're looking back and saying, like, okay, for example, here's an example for anyone who hasn't read the book, because I sometimes talk like as if people will know what I'm on about. So one of the things I give as an example is dressing my daughter in a cardigan that has been knitted by her grandmother, like a little knitted garment, and closing the buttons and saying this is a female text, because of the fact that they're stitches that were knitted by her grandmother spending time. And in what way could you consider that a text that persists after the woman who made it is no longer in the room? You know what I mean? Like, can this be a female text? Can this be the legacy of female time spent doing this kind of labor? So that was the kind of thing I was asking myself again and again, and really trying to make sense of it. And that was one of the examples in which the book, oh, this is hard to describe without sounding kind of mystical, but the book kind of wanted to be what it is. You know, sometimes I felt like I had to get out of its way. I was trying to make sense of what it could be to be a female text, and to offer solutions to that to the reader. But essentially, I feel like there comes a point where, when the author lets go of a book, that the reader comes to it and comes to that refrain and is invited into the process of saying, well, is this a female text? And what is a female text? The way that I wrote it, I wanted to puzzle over that phrase and to hold it up to the reader and say, this is strange. What does this mean? And I hope that the reader can feel themselves embraced into that process of puzzling through something. You know, sometimes something is mysterious, and that phrase came to me in a mysterious way. And that was what I tried to communicate.
You yourself explain in the book that the word text has its Latin origin in weaving and in fusion, which makes every kind of sense now with what you're saying about the sweater and the rest of that. I wonder, Doireann, is this a good time for us to hear an extract, or perhaps from the text?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jayanti. I'm going to read a little from fairly close to the start of the book. It kind of sets the scene for the adventure that is to follow. When we first met, I was a child, and she had been dead for centuries. Look, I am 11, a girl who is terrible at sums and at sports, a girl given to staring out windows, a girl whose only real gift lies in daydreaming. The teacher snaps my name, startling me back to flimsy prefab. Her voice makes it a fine day in 1773 and sets English soldiers crouching in ambush. I add ditch water to drench their knees. Their muskets point towards a young man who is tumbling from his saddle now in slow, slow motion. A woman rides in to kneel over him, her voice rising in an antique formula of breath and syllable the teacher calls a quina, a keen to lament the dead. Her voice generates an echo strong enough to reach a girl in the distance with dark hair and bitten nails. Me.
Thank you. Well, following on that reading, I must ask, what is your current relationship to the poem then? You've traced how the protagonist reacts to the poem at, as a chore, as a school homework, as, as a very passionate response later in life. And then, of course, as a mother, she continues to. Has the writing this book closed the door then on your relationship with the poem?
It's so interesting that you would raise that question, because during the process of writing the book, I became very fearful as I was drawing closer to the end of it. And I think the cause of that fear was that I was afraid to finish writing the book, because I was afraid that that would mean that this intimacy or this closeness I had developed, or almost like this friendship I had developed with this woman who lived hundreds of years before me, would disappear, and that her presence would dissipate and that she'd be gone. And I didn't want to finish writing the book because I didn't want her to go. But I did finish writing it and she didn't go. So I was foolish to be afraid about that. So I still return to the book, and like I mentioned at the very start of our conversation, there are ways in which a book teaches you something even after you've finished writing it. And that is one thing that this book has taught me, is that the presence of the past, the presence of the people who lived in the past, they can stay with us. When we invite them into our hearts, they can remain with us, that sense of a presence. And the poem itself is so vital to that relationship for me, because this is not just an artifact, but this is the echo of her voice. These are her words. And when I speak this poem out loud to myself, as I'll speak a verse of it out loud for you in a minute, if you'll allow me that, it feels very much to me like this is her voice echoing through my body, and imagine, and I'm so grateful to the Irish Embassy there for facilitating this conversation between us, Jayanti, because it's extraordinary to me that we are celebrating the life of Eileen Duffney Connell, the both of us together and the audience, and that her words are still alive and echoing now so far from where she first spoke them. It's so moving to me that she's alive with us now. And that's the power of literature, isn't it? Spoken literature and written literature. Absolutely. And we're so fortunate to have that and to share that with each other.
And how global it is. It really,
yes.
If you'll read us a part of the poem, it will be delightful. Of course, at the end of your edition, you have the translation as well as the Irish. And once you've read it, will you speak a little while about the Irish language, what translation has meant to you, and what your relationship to the language is, as well as to the English language, if there is a point.
Of course, I'd love to. Okay, yeah,
lovely. Thank you.
So I'll speak Eileen Duff's poem in the Irish language, As Gaeilge Dús, and then just the first verse of it, and then I'll speak it in my own translation in English.
Wonderful.
Mochrá go daingan tú, lá dá bhacathú ag ceantaí an bharraige, thug mo chúil araguit, thug mo chrí taitneamhuit, Délias charad flat I bhad ó bhalil. Oh, my beloved, steadfast and true, the day I first saw you by the market's thatched roof, how my eye took a shine to you, how my heart took delight in you. I fled my companions with you to soar far from home with you. So that's a little flavour of how the poem sounds.
It's wonderful.
About my relationship with the Irish language and with translation.
Yes, please.
It's very complicated. I think like any country that was colonized and whose language and culture was so imperiled and endangered by a dominant culture, where there's often a sense of internalized ambivalence there, almost towards the tradition that's so strong in you and the language that's so strong in you. Yes. So I really, it's very complicated, and it's very complicated for other Irish people as well. So I always hesitate to speak openly about it, and will just say that I only speak on behalf of myself. Like, people have very complex set of beliefs, particularly around the Irish language and their own perceptions. But from my perspective, I'm so grateful to have the Irish language in my life. And a large part of the reason that I do is because I attended Gaelscoileanna as a child. That's an educational system of immersion education. So I wouldn't have had a word of Irish until I was 4 years old, at which point I was enrolled in a school where only Irish was spoken to me and everything was taught through Irish in a very gentle way. But like, you know, in any multilingual society, children are like sponges. They pick up whatever they're presented with and whatever they're immersed in. So that was how I came to learn Irish, and I'm intensely grateful for that, even as an adult, because it meant that I came to the language and to that sense of linguistic heritage, free of a lot of the complexities of other people who go through our education system and are taught the language in different ways. And it has a real purity for me. And when I speak Irish, it's almost as if something in me takes flight in a different way. What I love about it is the sense that you're speaking you're speaking from a different part of yourself in some way. You know, you're using words that were used by your ancestors, and that there's a particular power in that. Like, often when I'm speaking about it, I think of, you know, an escalator. When you stand on an escalator and you're carried along by these metal steps, that's what it feels like for me. Like, when I'm speaking English, it sometimes feels like I'm walking up the stairs. And when I'm speaking Irish, it feels like I'm stepping onto an escalator and being carried along by these ancestral words. And sometimes the phrases and things are ancestral ways of encapsulating a feeling. And that feels so, it feels so moving to me, you know, and I'm so grateful that I have that access in myself to the language. And not everybody has that, you know, so I'm very fortunate to have it.
It makes a lot of sense to a lot of us here in India, because there are very few people who have only one language in India. Most people are dealing with, in my case, it was, it was only after the age of 5 that I encountered English, because the language of the home was Hindi. But so it was, it's slightly reversed, but it's so applicable to so many of us who had a similar experience. And of course, it brings up the questions which we will not go into of colonization. Okay,
we'll be here all day if we start down that road.
Yes, absolutely. But I wanted to ask you also about the writing of poetry, which is, of course, what you're primarily known for. Now, this is your first prose work. And it is, to my mind, it's poetry disguised as prose in several ways. I mean, your metaphors are, describing something as being as sleek as an opera cloak, as vulnerable as a fontanelle. I mean, these are just so moving, the way you, the language you use, and of course the compression that you use. Can you tell me, before I start taking all the questions that are pouring in, and I will do that, but just as a last question, what made you jump track to prose writing?
Well, this book insisted on itself, and the voice of Eileen Dovney Connell insisted on herself. And I felt almost in some ways helpless when faced with the force of that. You know, there was no way to communicate what I needed to communicate of her and of the detective story and adventure that I went on in trying to find out more about her through poetry. It just didn't feel like it would work for me in that way. So I kind of had to, is the short answer. But the slightly longer answer is that you're absolutely and most astutely correct in saying that it's poetry disguised as prose. And I would only add poorly disguised as prose in some places. There are some paragraphs in this book that if you read them aloud, you'll hear yourself that they are actually lines of poetry, but just as prose. So I think I need to practice my prose skills a lot more to get the poetry out of them, you know.
No, it totally demands reading aloud in certain, quite apart from the poem you've attached at the end, which has to be spoken. I've got an interesting question here. Somebody's asking, your book is a lifesaver for anyone who has ever felt their grip on the world loosen in the short intervals between feeding one infant and attending to the cries of another? It's always easy to read a book, get carried away with what you read, but what is it to develop an intimate relationship with your character? Does it hurt you to mend their lives?
I think that that's a fascinating question, and the question of hurt and harm and influence that a character can inflict on the author's life is something, again, that we could be here talking about all day. I think I definitely would say that in terms of the physical toll of writing a book like this, that was an extraordinary part of it for me. You know, like, I changed physically a lot as I was writing this book. The parts of it that were very demanding, there were times where it was similar to how I look physically when I have a small baby, where, you know, I have dark circles under my eyes, I get very thin, I'm not taking proper care of myself. And like, I know it's an easy metaphor, but there were moments where I felt like I'm trying to draw someone else out of my body, you know, and it did feel a little bit like when I would have an infant and I was trying to sustain them while also balancing the care of other people that were important, you know, within our family. And yeah, it definitely took a physical toll. And I think it would be a really interesting discussion to have with a whole variety of authors about the different characters that are made to come alive within the pages of a book, and what the physical cost of that is on the person who is trying to lure them up on the page. You know, it's something that I felt to a very great extent, but it was a price I was more than willing to pay.
Yeah.
And sometimes it felt very it felt like it made sense because she felt so real to me. Why wouldn't I be suffering in attending to the parts of her life that were very hard, you know? But yeah, it wasn't an easy book to write.
Let me go on to, because we've got two more interesting questions following. I'll just go on to them.
Thank you, Jayanti.
Thank you, Doireann, really, because I'd like to go back to what you've just said, but I think we'd better give the listener to these questions a chance. Could you tell us more about the research you did surrounding the life of
Eileen Dove, yeah. And it's funny because here Ireland is such a small country, and yet within Ireland there are so many different ways to pronounce the name Eileen, Eibhli, Fada N. Some people say Evelyn, some people say Eileen, so everyone pronounces it differently. The research process was quite intensive, but I was extremely fortunate in that there had been so many others who had written a little here and there about her life, or about areas that were peripheral to her life I was able to draw on. And I don't think I could have written the book without those other texts, if you know what I mean. One in particular by the author who names herself Mrs. Morgan John O'Connell, who she had written a book that gathered together a lot of the documents that had been found in the desk of one of Eileen Dove's brothers. And so there were a lot of letters there and that kind of thing, and mostly attended to areas that they would have had to attend to in the running of their household. You know, a lot of it was about budgeting and that kind of thing, but every now and then you would get a glimpse of a woman, whether Eileen Dove or her mother or sister, within those letters, and that allowed me kind of a glimpse to the world that they were existing in. So I was very grateful that that book existed and had been published many, many years ago as well.
Well, am I right in understanding then that you were researching the female lives through male texts?
Yes.
There was, okay.
Yeah, so it was kind of an erasure. I kind of tried to, in a slightly radical way, flip the erasure that has occurred traditionally, where female lives are erased from male texts, by going to male texts and erasing the men to see if the women were still there. So that was the methodology that I was attempting to use on those old letters. But the other thing that viewer who asked about the research, the other thing that really enabled me to pursue this was the fact that so many of our archives have been digitized, and so I didn't always need to leave the home and go to the archives, because I was able to access them through the digitization that has occurred. And I was intensely and repeatedly very grateful for that. There were times where I was awake in my own home at 2 o'clock in the morning and trawling through archives and thinking to myself, I wouldn't be able to pursue this research if it wasn't for this. So the many nameless, faceless archivists that scanned all those documents, I'm very grateful to them too.
Let me slip in a last question, because this is an interesting one. Kabir asks, would you agree that this book, as I see it, is a psychic drama on a knife edge between appropriation and recovery? What are your thoughts about this?
Appropriation and recovery. Yeah, it was interesting because I wondered, like at one point I wrote within the book, the line between trying to communicate the life of a woman who lived hundreds of years before me and stepping on her toes was very thin. And the way I phrase in the book is like the sense of, was I engaging in trespass or theft? You know, when we wade into history and pluck an interesting character from centuries of history, how dare we? How dare we do that? How dare we appropriate another person's life and assume to speak and to write and to research it? And yet we can't help ourselves. The whole history of literature is involved with this, you know, and we're all implicated in it as readers, that sense of really being hungry for those kind of stories, the kind of stories that are immersive and that place you in the past and make you feel like you're there. I think as readers, we thrive on those experiences, the way in which it allows us to feel as though we're living in another time as well as in our own times. And it's probably a necessary evil for an author to walk that line between appropriation and attempting to voice the story of another in this case. But I mean, maybe it's very brazen of me to say that, because the dead can't speak back and say, no, I didn't want you to write that about my life. So,
well, this leads us into the next question, which is, Ria asks that if you could meet Evelyn today, what would you say to her?
I would thank her, Ria. I would thank her for the way in which she lived her life. I would thank her for her words that have sustained me through her poem. And I would ask her to forgive me for attempting to write her life. And I would hope that she would reply that she was pleased that I had in some way. And to repeat myself, look at us all now, you know, she's here with us. I can feel her, you know, I can feel her here. And it's extraordinary to me to be allowed this opportunity to speak with all of you about Eileen Dubh Ní Chonaill and how important she is. Because she's alive again when we're speaking her verses out loud. She's alive, you know.
Doireann, we're a minute away from the end, so I'm going to ask you a question myself. It's a cheat question, because you may answer and say, go and figure this out for yourself. But in the poem, there is a hag who observes the death of Arthur, and she can do nothing to change the process of history, but she's there in the capacity of an observer. And I have wondered time and time again, who is the hag? Is it the reader? Is it the wife? Is it perhaps you?
I think, and like you, we share this because, Jayanti, I have spent so many hours wondering the same thing, you know, within the poem, in that awful moment where Eileen Dubh comes upon the body of her husband thrown on the ground. There is already there this elderly woman who's cloaked in black,
yes,
who
exactly.
has put the edge of her cloak over Arthur's body, yes, in order to shelter him in some way.
That's the person.
I do feel like that's every person who reads the Queena. I feel like that's us as the viewer and as the reader and as the listener. I feel like that's us. We're there shielding his body in some way, and we're completely powerless. We can't prevent what's going to happen from happening, but we're there with her. We're there with her in that moment where she stands over her beloved husband's body, and we witness her speaking.
Yes.
And that's what I believe. And I love that figure of the hag so much.
I do
and
too.
I'm so glad that you picked up on that as well.
Absolutely. We're all out of time. I've been sent the message, but I thank you from the
Thank you.
No, really, this has been a wonderful session, and it's opened up even more avenues into the book. Thank you very much, Doireann.
Thank you for having me, and thanks to the embassy and to everyone in Jaipur, and hopefully some other year I'll be there in person.
That has to be organized in some way. But thank you, JLF, for organizing this as well. Okay.
Thank you, Doireann Ní Ghríofa and Jayanti Naju Seth, for such an intriguing conversation. We wish you were here with us in person this year, but hoping next year. But thank you so much for being part of Virtual Jaipur Literature Festival. We thank our partner, the Embassy of Ireland, for supporting this session, and we thank our celebration partner, Diageo. Thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Please stay logged on to continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers that have been specially curated for you. As you're aware, the cultural sector has been critically impacted by the pandemic, and while we have braced ourselves to embrace the new normal, we have struggled to ensure that we can continue to bring you a free flow of knowledge and ideas. We would love for you to support us at Teamwork Arts. Any contribution is welcome and would help spread knowledge and ideas seamlessly against all odds. You can also tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021 at @JaipurLitFest. The festival is protected by Dettol. Hope to see you next time. Thank you.